Today in the podcast, we have Caleb Gardner. He's the author of a new book called No Point B and also the CEO and founder of a consulting group called 18 Coffees. I really like this idea he has about really the only constant is change kind of thing. And that in any kind of company considering going from A to B, the idea is there really is no point B. Everything is subject to change along the way. I'm really oversimplifying. So let's go talk to him and jump right into the podcast. Caleb Gardner, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being on with me today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Caleb is the CEO and founder of 18 Coffees and lots of other incredible accolades and stories that maybe I'll enter one with. But today we're going to talk about kind of what he's doing in the world, but also kind of through the lens of this new book he's got out, No Point B, which I can say I've read a lot of and was hoping to finish today, but didn't. But I think I know enough to get going on it. So Caleb, if you give us a little bit of maybe kind of how you got here, kind of an amazing story, and kind of what led to the book, and then we'll jump into some of the ideas there.
Sure, that sounds great. I think the book is really the culmination of our work at 18 Coffees and a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years in my career, coming from digital innovation and communications at Edelman and Bain and Company, political organizing with President Obama, having run part of his digital infrastructure in the second administration. And then coming into 18 Coffees and doing the kind of consulting work we do, which is really taking a lot of that innovation and strategy work and looking at how do we help organizations that want to change the world, that are really trying to think about the intersection of business and society and how that means they should transform. How can we use what we know about those things to help them transform and be better and hopefully, big picture, move the economy in a more inclusive and sustainable direction. I mean, that's really our mission. Right. What we found was that, the actual tools that we have for transformation were pretty old. When we talk about change management, it was often from a very linear perspective, unfreeze the organization, switch some things around and then refreeze it. I just didn't think that was really that practical. Like, it's not how the world actually works. Like, things move too fast. Right. We get more data points more quickly than we ever have. We have to pivot. We have to rethink our assumptions about everything from where we're going to find value in the market to what do our employees want out of our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Like, we're just constantly thinking differently about the direction of our business. And so we really thought that we need to start teaching business leaders to think more recursively, more about making change a practice. And so the book No Point B is really about that. It's about recognizing that change is not linear. It's something that is happening all the time. And especially now when we are being influenced by the effects of technology, when we are trying to figure out what is being a conscious, ethical company means, because our consumers and our employees and increasingly our shareholders want that. It's a really tough thing to do, and we wanted to recognize that and start talking about tools to do that.
That's great. Because one of the things I connected with right away was, and I hope this is kind of on the same page, is that I feel like in our business, a lot of the stuff we end up fighting is a desire for certainty in a world and a situation that can't possibly deliver it. I'm sort of reminded of, I can't remember which senator it was, but someone was at one point sort of standing on a pulpit demanding a date certain when the pandemic would be over. I was like, that's not how this works. That's not the world that we're in. And so like thinking about it, and I think for me, especially through the lens of technology, like it's always in change. I feel like some of the way that our company matured the most was honestly moving from a mindset of, well, shouldn't we be able to deliver certainty? Shouldn't we be able to know that, like, looking at this spec sheet, that Tuesday, February 7th at 7:55 a.m., we will be done? Like, shouldn't we be able to do it? I think we walked around with almost a sense of guilt and obligation that we would be able to do that. And the freeing sort of aspect of, oh, wait, these things they are always in flux, and the value is in navigating all the million kind of decisions need to be made along the way. So I feel like I kind of soapboxed that for a minute, but is that kind of along the lines of what you're thinking? And you've got like a nuanced version of how society views of that I'm really interested in too.
Yeah. I mean, I love that you bring in that perspective, because I think you and I, coming from a digital strategy, digital products, data perspective, it is both, like, we recognize it because we're in the weeds of it, like, recognize there's never a time where technology just stops. Like, you build a website, for example, that website has to be maintained. SEO best
Yeah.
practices change. New opportunities come with different kinds of platforms. Like, there's no end point to technology itself. It's always evolving. But I write about this in the book. Technology gives us the facade of certainty, right? Like,
Hmm.
especially because of how
Sure.
many data points that we have access to now, clients and even the narrative around data is that it can provide that certainty. So
Yeah.
our clients come to us, I'm sure yours do to you, saying like, "Oh, but we can know more than we've ever known before because we can know XYZ on data points." I'm like, "Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily give you the right insight or help you with decision making. A lot of it is noise." And so,
Yeah.
once we recognize, to your point, that it does take a practice of constantly reevaluating what data points are we getting, is it giving us any useful information,
Huh?
that helps with that kind of long-term navigating, changing the direction of the ship.
Yeah. So maybe talk a little bit about when you first kind of had this "there's no point B" idea, and you've got some apocryphal tales of pitching to people who missed the boat, Netflix type situations. Like, what were some of those stories, maybe to kind of illustrate for people what would be kind of the kind of situations that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we really came to a head, I guess, on the idea of the book, especially the title, in 2020. You can imagine what was going on in 2020 with the
Sure.
pandemic and all of that. But we'd already been talking about it. Like, let's talk about like how we change differently, and then all of a sudden we were all changing due to the
Yeah.
same circumstances. Like, it was just wildly applicable. In fact, we were worried. I was worried, when we sold the idea for the book and I started writing it, I was like, oh God, I hope this still feels really applicable in 2 years when it comes out.
Right. I got
I
you.
know, right? Like, it's
Uh,
hilarious to think about now. Like,
and in
now, I think,
retrospect, right? Yeah.
yeah, I think everyone just takes the idea of change being constant as a cliche at this point, but that was always true.
Um,
We've used examples over the years of, Blockbuster and Netflix is kind of the classic one, but there's all kinds of examples, right, of companies not seeing disruption coming.
Yeah.
And I do, to your point, have in the book a couple personal examples where I had the same thing, where I was in a boardroom and we're pitching a big idea. We're saying, here's the data points to support it, and there's institutional will to keep doing the same things because no one wants to stick out their neck and be the one that suggests doing things differently and get, really, really dinged in their career or in their leadership position for that. That I feel like has always been the case. Like, for business, for the last 50 years, I think that could have been the case. I think that what's different about the moment that we're in now is that is both a truism that has always been true, and we're in a particularly disruptive moment the last few years, right?
Yeah.
Where the
Because I keep
opportunity
thinking
and
that.
risk. Yeah. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I like your idea that it's always been true is interesting, because if it's always been true, how do we not notice it? And I think this is in the book, and I believe this too, that really it's you don't notice the speed of change until it's changing so quickly as it is now, that I was like, oh
That's
wait, maybe
right.
this has always been the case. When you look at, it took 100 years to go from steam engine to whatever else, and then within another 50 years there's a self-driving car that can go A to an actual point B. But like that, those kinds of things, now we see it. Is that kind of the driver? And I think it'd be another truism to say that it's only accelerating. So like, what
Yep.
about that acceleration will be true, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we have more visibility into it than we've ever had before. It was just happening,
Yeah.
behind the scenes in different markets and different geographies. And we're just such a globally connected community now that we have visibility into all the things that are changing in ways that are really overwhelming. Like, we don't
Yeah.
have the mental capacity to really process it or determine what's important on any given day, right? Like, that's the leadership challenge now. And one of the reasons why I say
Yeah.
like all leaders are change leaders, because we're constantly just interpreting and reinterpreting all of the news cycles, all of the data points every day as leaders, and it's
Okay.
exhausting. It's hard to make
Yeah.
decisions. It's hard to do strategy well.
Yeah. Well, so maybe to make it even harder, you have a great perspective on how this weaves into the employee kind of experience and societal experience and
Hmm.
kind of diversity, inclusion, and other kind of topics. Talk about how those all weave together with kind of leading changes as an organization and leader.
Yeah, I mean, I think that global connected perspective that I was just saying leaders struggle with. Employees are struggling with it too. Like we see all the ways in which the world is broken. We see all the ways in which our company is broken and how our company is being talked about externally all the time.
Yeah.
And so I think the thing that is undervalued and underappreciated right now is that employees need to be persuaded too. Like they need to know that you're going in the right direction. They need to know why we made one decision and we didn't make another. And I think we underappreciate the utilization of internal comms and internal persuasion really about the direction of our company. And that's at the team level up to the CEO level. Like we release one memo, we have one meeting, we kind of make an announcement, and we assume everyone has all the information they need about, everything. And it's not true. Like people need to be, that old marketing adage that says someone needs to hear something 7 times to really understand it and appreciate it. Like that's true of our employees too. Like we need to be putting a lot more effort in helping people understand their role in a bigger change happening and why we're doing that. And is it right? Is it not? And I think the other thing that's underappreciated that's really unique to where we're at now is the intersection of our workplace and the rest of the world, because we're in this global community. We're reading news, I'm pointing at my screen. This is literally me. Like have one window up about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, and then one window up is my Slack. Like I'm having conversations with my internal team at the same time as I'm engaging with the larger world. Like in a remote work environment. Yeah, that's been true for a few years, but what we did in the last couple of years is we distributed work even more through remote and hybrid workplaces. And so now we've individualized our work experience to the extent that we don't have those same cultural influences every day by just being around the people we work with. Like it takes a lot more intentionality now to build work culture. And so we're a lot more influenced by world culture. And I think that for good and bad, right? Like that's not necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just the truth. So like as business leaders, we're competing with everything else now. We don't have everyone's full attention at all times because we don't have butts in seats.
Yeah. And that's, just speaking of change, I think that's a pretty massive change to go from a workforce where lots of leaders would have said, well, you have to be in the office to, the joke I always tell is that I'm a real estate genius. I renewed our lease on February 1st of 2020. Within 6 weeks, everybody was home.
Yeah.
And like having to manage that, in a way, the surprising thing that I think we in some kinds of companies found was that it was actually kind of no big deal. Like the work we did was, you could do kind of anywhere, and that was fine.
Right.
But then as time passed, the real issue was, well, everyone already knew each other, and there was a relationship, and that was different, but you could find a thread, but then anyone hired that was new, now the change manager was, well, how do you start a new job where you can't get to meet anybody? And there's, you work, but you make friends, you want to get lunch or whatever it is, like, and now you're in different cities or you can't even be next to each other. That was a really isolating experience. I don't know if we fully solved, we keep trying things, but that's just one of probably 100 things that companies had to deal with. And I know a lot of people, like now getting kind of trying to connect to your idea a little bit is, then later you saw businesses say, okay, no, now everyone back in the office, and employees like, no. And I think they were kind of surprised to hear that, and that's kind of like, that's a kind of an evolution a lot of leaders had to go through.
That's right. Yeah. And they're still going through. I mean, they're still having the same back and forth today. Right. It's fascinating. I think we've now take certain level of autonomy for granted, and we don't want that autonomy taken away on top of, the commute times and all of that. I actually saw a study recently that said the one thing that will get employees excited about getting back to the office is the opportunity to connect and build friendships with their coworkers. That was like the one thing, which makes total sense, 100%. Right? But we don't, as leaders who are trying to get people back in person, emphasize that part. Like it's kind of an underappreciated part of how we talk about building office culture. Yeah.
Well, that's really great. So what are some things that are happening now that you're seeing as you're working with companies that are like, what are the big change issues that maybe our people, like we just talked about, or other things? What are the things, like if I'm a leader, today it's October 2022, what are the things you see like in the next year that people should be focusing on that maybe they're not?
I think that the conversation between what we were just talking about hybrid work and how many days are we in the office, how many days are we not, how do we build office culture when we need to onboard new employees versus like reimagine our old office culture, which, by the way, when people did that exact transition, like you were saying, they didn't really appreciate how much of the old office culture just kind of naturally got ported. Like they didn't really self-critique enough in a way that I think
Yeah.
would help new people come on, right? Like they just assumed we would keep doing things the way that we did. So I think those are conversations that will continue, but now will be framed by the economic environment that we're in. So, we keep hearing about this recession that's inevitable, which is fascinating to me because it's like how much is just talking about it going to make it inevitable?
Totally.
Right?
Absolutely. I totally
We're like, the pending recession. I'm like, is there a pending recession? We keep hearing about it, but the economy actually grew last quarter a little bit. Like, it's just, we're in a really weird spot. Anyway, but if that does happen and we have midterm elections coming up, we don't know what the outcome of those. So the environment's going to be completely different next year in ways that will affect the workplace, I think, the economic environment, the political environment. So that's something that I would be, speaking of change being something that happens all the time, it's going to be something that we're going to be dealing with in the next 6 months for sure.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you talk a little about in the book is how, the sort of like the idea of change being constant is something that leaders have to embrace, obviously. What's a symptom of someone who has that fixed mindset that maybe they did a self-diagnosis? For example, for me, I would say that I thought I was super progressive in all things managing the company. And the one thing I discovered on February 2nd or whatever last year was actually I kind of wanted people in the office. I couldn't put my finger up, but I kind of wanted it. I was disabused of that within about, 48 hours of the other reality that became true. But I feel like we work with clients where I see little elements of they're stuck in an old mindset and what are things you've seen that are sort of like the easy diagnostics of, okay, you might need to think about what you're doing here?
I mean, I will say that on a personal level and then on an organizational level. And I would say on both, I would reflect on how you are talking about your organization's challenges. So on a personal level, we use this language about ourselves like, oh, I could never learn that. I could never do that. We have this absolutism language about our job responsibilities, about our ability to understand new technology, for example, that really stresses some people out. Some people look really strictly at, the job responsibilities in their job description and really resist having things added or taken away. So there are certain things that are just kind of classic fixed mindset things that we don't often use. We realize we're repeating to ourselves, whereas we can say things like, this is an opportunity for me. I can learn, I can grow, I can find new areas of value within the organization that are going to be beneficial for my career. Or as leaders, we can say like, yes, this is going to be short-term stressful for my people, but long-term, it's going to create value for, my company. I think people are going to get, really a lot of satisfaction over this direction of where we're going. There's a really great reframing of those things. And we've taken some clients through just exercises where we'll write some of those things down and literally just like try to reframe them. On an organizational level, we often do the same kind of fixed mindset stuff only collectively. Like there's these things called organizational defensive routines that we often don't realize we're using. So if you've ever said something like, oh, that could never happen here, or we could never make that work here. Those are those collected like cultural things we've told ourselves about what the organization, what's possible about, our company. And so that we need to do the same thing about collectively changing the narrative about what is possible within our walls.
It's really interesting. So forgive my book plug, but you basically just gave me the first chapter of the stuff I focus on in the book I wrote over the pandemic.
Totally planned.
Right? Yeah. The way I discovered sort of why growth mindset was like the key thing was I interviewed maybe about 75 people or something like that. And not all of them made it the book. And there was this big group of people who were stuck in this sort of eddy of not going anywhere in their business or their company. And they just had all these like, that'll never work, kind of, we tried that, or that doesn't work in our industry, and all these kind of things. And
Right.
I find myself, my kids play sports, and we were talking about, like, if you think you're not going to make the free throw, you're probably not going to make the free throw. But if you at least see the possibility of it, you see, like, we can get better at this, or we're going to try new things, and really understanding that anyone who's in a creative, any field, you realize that, if you do 10 things, 9 will be terrible and maybe 1 will be okay, and that's the one you go focus on. I think
Right.
you had like that kind of 7-20-10 idea, which I like too. Um, that we'll talk about in a second. But I think that's the growth mindset was the gateway idea. Like, if you believe you can change, if you're
Right.
willing to experiment, then anything's possible. But if you believe that, like, this is how things are, I think you just will experience probably a slow, inevitable decline, and you won't really notice what's happening, and all of a sudden it'll be too late or something. But that gave you a long story on that. But that's really, I'm 100%
It's
on
true
board with
though.
that, 'cause that's what we found the difference. Yeah.
Those are the things when I forget who said culture eats strategy. Like those are the things where we can say we want to do whatever, but if our culture doesn't
Yeah.
think that we can because we repeat these narratives back to each other, we're
Right.
we're never going to be able to make it work. If we're
Yeah.
if we're
And
trying for the free throw and every time we miss, we say, "Oh, I'll never do that." Right? Like
right.
as opposed to, "Oh, I just missed this one time, but I'll get it next time." Like big differences.
Yeah. And and hopefully, to kind of like tag on your idea for the book, that I think we're not saying everything should be an experimentation. I think you kind of even said like 70% can be defensive, and it's really
Yeah.
just this little sliver of 5 or 10%. Try a bunch of crazy things. Not like crazy is the wrong word. Try a bunch of experiments that you have an idea about. Here's what these should probably produce, and here's the outcomes we're looking for. And then look at a measurement and keep trying things. That's how you find that one breakthrough idea. I know there was a thing recently where they were talking about, like, how you monetize information, and it's this kind of idea that's out there that everyone, like I hate these buzzwords, like, big data and stuff like that, but, like, there is a way to monetize it if you really focus on a bunch of experiments. There is just one way to do it, and it'll be different for
Right.
every company. But that idea, I think, is the experimentation. I think is part of the key.
100%. And it's not, I love what you just said. I mean, it's exactly what I wrote. It's not about like taking such big risks that you're going to tank your company. It's about consistently trying things over time and actually setting aside budget, setting aside resources to say, we are going to continually just test new ideas and be okay with some failing and some are going to be great and most aren't, and that's okay.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. You run into organizations that have a fixed mindset, or culturally even have a fixed mindset. Um, what has worked to convert a fixed mindset culture to a growth culture? Or is it just like you need to start over, or new leadership, or do something like change within the people first, and
Sure.
then that creates change within the organization? Like, how has that been successful?
It really depends on the cause. So like if it is, oftentimes there is let's say there's a CEO, a CFO, and a CHRO, or some other like C-suite makeup, and there's one like real big detractor, then that's a personality issue, that's a leadership issue. And once that
Yeah.
person turns over, or whatever happens, like that makes a huge cultural difference because they're in the
Yeah.
C-suite, and as you know, because that's probably happened to many of your clients, it's happened to mine, like it just changes the culture practically overnight.
Sure.
So that's one issue. If it's more of a systemic issue, it's like not just maybe leadership actually wants to change, but they're having a hard time with the rest of the org, or maybe one department
Yeah.
or whatever it ends up being. Then we just try to diagnose like what's going on. Again, what narratives are we repeating to each other that
Yeah.
either leadership can address more directly, or we can create some cultural moments like workshops, trainings, just day-long retreats, something where it's outside of the norm, to where we can look
Uh,
at problems differently. We can reframe things. Sometimes all it takes is being able to get out of the everyday where we're just doing the same thing over and over again, or saying the same things, and creating different language, different opportunities to see problems differently, different opportunities to hear from each other. Maybe it's you're actually creating space for people to vent or like say things that they don't feel like they can say
yeah.
in normal meetings, like, so it
Yeah.
really, we've diagnosed it a few different ways, but those cultural moments can be really powerful.
I really like, because a little while ago you said culture eats strategy, and really when you think about it, if you have a fixed mindset that this is how things are, there isn't a single company where every employee would unanimously agree everything we do is great and the right way to do it, and I'm really
Right.
happy with everything we're doing. And I think if you just even expose the idea that we're open to change experiments and trying things new, all of a sudden I think engagement shoots through the roof, because like, oh my God, I've been waiting for years to say, what if, if we just did these in a different order, or let's change the
Right.
way we're talking to people, or like you get to have your ideas out there and then try them, experiment, and then you can see if they worked or didn't. But now all of a sudden everyone's engaged in moving the company forward, as opposed to, they'll never,
Yeah.
they're
But it
never
it
gonna
takes
listen to me.
demonstrating that what you're saying is actually true. Like I think
Uh-huh.
leadership saying this is where we want to go is a great starting point, but it's not the end point. To
Mhm.
our point earlier about how often you have to communicate things, you have to repeat that message, and then you have to demonstrate it. Like you have to find ideas that you can sponsor and say like, yes, this
Uh-huh.
person had a different idea, and now we're going to do this
Yeah.
thing so that people know that what they are saying in terms of changing direction is actually true. So you got to find some ways to like make sure the proof is there too.
Yeah. Um, do you have any stories of that being really successful that you can share, or even anecdotally, and
Uh.
kind of changing the names to protect the innocent?
We definitely have done ongoing work with one client that I'm thinking of in the nonprofit industry that um, has many different employees across many different chapters and has a pretty stubborn narrative about how their leadership is working. And we have done basically not only several different kind of leadership working sessions with employees to again say the right things repeatedly,
Yeah.
but basically a roadshow, so where they can say that in like all kinds of different offices within the company, and then create feedback loops with those offices too, so that employees can do what you were saying about like,
Yeah.
oh, I've always thought we should be doing this, and now here's my
Uh-huh.
opportunity to tell leadership and have them respond. And then,
Right.
the thing that we've been working with them on though is like, what are you going to do with those ideas? Like you can't
Yeah.
do everything everyone wants to do,
Yeah.
right? Like there has to be some expectations management, and that
Uh-huh.
expectations management is an ongoing practice because of what we were saying that when we first came on. Like the world is constantly changing, so we have to manage expectations appropriately. At the scale of that client, it's tough because there's so much going on. There's so many different messages. So it takes real internal resources, like teams dedicated to this kind of thing.
Yeah. Um, okay. So maybe as the final thought, what's um like what's a change that you're working on for yourself for 18 copies through the end of the year, or
Uh,
next year? This sort of something you've got in mind.
oh, I love this question. What is the change? We are launching a new practice. So that's actually a pretty big
Oh,
change. We're launching a new practice focused on ESG. If you know ESG, it's the
okay.
environmental, social, and governance. It's shorthand for basically trying to report metrics back to shareholders and external stakeholders about your social impact and your environmental impact.
Yeah.
It's becoming a pretty standard reporting metric and a pretty standard way of bringing in a lot of other social responsibility related initiatives under one umbrella within an organization. So we have done
Yeah.
ESG related things for years, and finally we're just like following the marketplace really and saying like, here's what we think ESG strategy, as a whole should look like, and here's how these pieces fit in. So that's a new thing that we are launching and merchandising for ourselves as a company, and it's going to take again rethinking how we had solved other kinds of problems with a different
Mhm.
framework.
Sure, sure. Well, because you took that risk, I'll give you mine, so I'll put mine on record too. The thing I'm working on is something that I'm calling delivering on the Caxi promise, which is
Oh,
that when I sell the company to prospective new employees, there's a
uh-huh.
story I tell that is 97% right, and I think the opportunity that we offer is a place to like be cared for, do great work, have like people push you and learn and grow, all those kind of things, and yet also for the business, and I think even probably incorrectly believing for the sake of the business, taking on work that maybe isn't a great fit, that
Yeah.
then people don't like, and it kind of live up to the promise. I feel like if we were to align to a promise of like, we do nothing but great work that really makes a difference for people who are trying to make a difference, then all of a sudden it's it's a perpetual motion machine at that point. And it's a little tweak, just a couple of things, a couple of misalignments. And I think for me, alignment for those people in a market that's really competitive to get the best people, I think that's probably how we're going to win. So that's a change. They'll have a little bit of near-term pain, probably mostly for me. But then I think long-term is going to be really successful for everybody. So
that's super fun.
So now it's on record. Now I have to actually do it.
That's right. You do.
But this has been great. I'll give you a plug. It's a really great book. It's a really interesting read. Lots of really good ideas that you can use.
Thank you.
It's really a pleasure talking with you today. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me.
The Leadership Superpowered podcast is brought to you by Caxi Interactive, a custom software development company focused on helping mid-market companies achieve enterprise value through creating custom software that optimizes their business, creates huge leaps in customer experience, and widens their moat of differentiation in the market.